Some philosophers are for both reading and flexing. People like to make known that they're reading and understanding Heidegger. They like to put Deleuze and Guattari on their good reads or make that yellow spine of Hegel's phenomenology prominent on their bookshelf. The Dimmicks in Melbourne had to put all their Nietzsche books in a locked glass cabinet because people kept stealing them. So these books must enjoy some special status beyond their philosophical content, which is online for free, to make them worth stealing. Iconic white old men like these will reliably impress both friends and strangers alike. Less iconic, deeper cuts will be more impressive to any observers who recognise the material. For example, Edith Witchergrad could get you more points than Zizek, but only if you manage to be seen by someone who recognises her work. Laruelle represents an extreme case in the above book-boasting guidelines because he's so sophisticated but challenging, subversive but obscure, and provocative but niche that it's not worth the effort for a recognition that will probably never come. Books like Philosophy and Non-Philosophy are not for flexing. They are only for reading if you can. And if you can, because you've gained something rare, they ought to be for something else too, if not for a broader research project, then at least for a review. But I don't think of this as a review. Reviews usually assume a transcendent posture akin to philosophy. Anyway, to what standard could we measure a text so singular in its mission? Rather, this is me trying to help carve a path into the text for you. I'm trying to show you a way in, but without the constraints a formal introduction to Laruelle would impose. There's too much ground to cover there. This is me practicing explaining what in Laruelle's thought I find so compelling. And I perform it as a bounce off Philosophy and Non-Philosophy, so as to say, this book is a big deal, let me try and show you how. So this is my non-review of Philosophy and Non-Philosophy by Francois Laruelle, first published in French in 1989 and translated into English by Taylor Adkins in 2013. And because this book is the first instance of Laruelle's articulation of his non-philosophy, what follows can also serve as an informal initial exposure to this non-standard thought, which tolerates no real introduction, only a happening. These things considered, it shouldn't surprise us that there's only one written review of Philosophy and Non-Philosophy on Amazon. It's titled Guaranteed Unintelligible.
Author promises, unless you already know what he's talking about, you will not be able to understand this book. Author keeps his promise.
There are two written reviews on Goodreads. One user reviews favourably with a 5-star rating, but the other describes a harrowing experience with the text.
I do realize it's supposed to be playful jokey, but Taylor Adkins' translator's introduction to Philosophy and Non-Philosophy single-handedly caused me to never read Laruelle, and then completely reject my entire metaphysics I'd been nurturing for years, centered around pure immanence.
I enjoyed Adkins' introduction, but was at an advantage, having read 3 other books by Laruelle prior. It's not introductory material for someone unfamiliar with his work or without a substantial background in philosophy, so I'm not surprised it scared this person away. They go on to describe their experience with the text's difficulty.
Something here, though, crossed the line from a challenge, but the texture of the challenge is necessary to lead somewhere rewarding, to what I could only receive as a genuine sadism, exceeding some semiotic pain tolerance I apparently have. I was pretty indignant about it.
They finish with a description of how they got into the occult and switched majors from physics to engineering. There's one other review of Philosophy and Non-Philosophy written by Ian James, which I found published in the Notre Dame Philosophical Reviews, though I might return to that later when I can bring the force of the concepts I'll be describing to bear on the criticisms therein, though it is a generally favourable review. For now, I'll replace it with a mention of Graham Harman's infamous review of the book Laruelle published 3 years earlier, Philosophies of Difference. Harman's review of Philosophies of Difference will serve here to represent the extreme end of a general sentiment, which obstructs new readers as much as anything Laruelle is responsible for in his prose or ideas. It's the notion that his work is too hard and not worth the effort required to understand it. In his review, Harman combines a misreading of the text with complaints about the prose's intelligibility with a doubt that the payoff is sufficient to warrant the effort. I don't blame Amazon or Goodreads reviewers for expressing their inability to understand the text. They fulfilled the assignment of those platforms by describing their subjective experiences. They didn't even have to show up at all. However, Harman has no excuse. He was supposed to do his homework for this review, but as one of Laruelle's translators, Adam Kotsko, points out in a reactionary blog post,
there is something altogether reckless and disrespectful about writing a review that suggests that even if the philosopher being harshly reviewed could respond to all the criticisms put forward, well, so what?
Criticisms like Harman's lose their force once you become used to Laruelle's style and know his broad intentions. They are complaints people throw from a distance to save them the trouble of having to fully engage with a work. but they only speak to those unfamiliar with non-philosophy. If I can show you what Laruelle's really up to, objections like Harman's, while perhaps still amusing in certain respects, will ultimately prove intellectually uninteresting. Even if you disagree with Laruelle, a surface-level understanding of his project will expect from detractors a response of proportionate sophistication. But presenting Laruelle's work in an accessible way at the outset presents a unique and fascinating challenge, and here is why. The only way to give you a consistent idea of what non-philosophy is to show you what it is without defining it. I believe this to be the main source of Laruelle's admittedly annoying tendency to not simply state what's going on or what non-philosophy is. These frustrations are warranted, but let them also stand as a testament to how ubiquitous and pervasive the habits of philosophical thought are, so that we feel entitled to demand definitions of the essence of a thing over and in a way that hinders our lived experience with it. Socrates would be proud, but Laruelle is ashamed on behalf of all of us. Though Laruelle can be extremely hard to understand, I will try to help you forgive him for this. We can at least say this much. Non-philosophy is not philosophy. Non-philosophy is a science and therefore needs its object of inquiry, its material, to think with. If science in general wishes to define itself, it inevitably starts doing philosophy. A philosophy of science, in that order. But as praxis, science is uninterested in defining itself. This concern comes from philosophy, and the need to overdetermine things according to their difference, define them to set their parameters. Lived science, certainly not scientism, which is a philosophy, lived science as it is practiced has only one concern, the description and discovery of its object according to certain axiomatic methods. If non-philosophy, as the science of philosophy, wishes to make itself known, a certain definition of its essence, a philosophy of this science, a philosophy of non-philosophy, would contradict its first principles. Non-philosophy, like everything else, would be subsumed by philosophy and become doubly hidden to us. For this reason, non-philosophy must not allow itself to become a philosophy by fulfilling readers' philosophical expectations. Granted, there is a sense, beyond the scope of these introductory remarks, to which non-philosophy must still be philosophical, but it will strive to be the smallest and most deprived, and therefore least hallucinatory, form of philosophy it can be. But for our present purposes, we'll say non-philosophy does not have the recourse to philosophy available to it in the task of its propagation. This science cannot allow itself to become its object, namely philosophy, because then it would lose all perspective of it, becoming the thing it intends to work with, imprisoned as the prisoner it seeks to liberate. So, we will instead start in a non-standard way. You already know what non-philosophy is. You've never had to call it something, never thought to make it a thing, but you've been listening to me do it this whole time. The above rules of book boasting, and general reactions to Laruelle's thought, appear from the perspective of philosophy to be a sort of naive second-order abstraction full of irreverent presuppositions. But from the perspective of our lived immanent given experience, it was completely natural to regard these philosophies as mere material, to be compared for reasons foreign to the intentions and priorities of the works themselves. A non-standard inversion was performed, and we didn't need any philosophical concepts to do it. We suspended philosophy's authority in order to regard it according to our lived experience. This much philosophy can tolerate, because the instant philosophy itself receives more careful attention, one of its configurations will emerge to claim sufficiency for the whole situation and beyond. It will claim to be enough to explain and account for everything. The challenge of the project of non-philosophy, which Laruelle has discovered as a need evinced in the boring and repetitive practice of contemporary philosophy, doesn't lie in generating a non-philosophy in the broad sense, which is already immediately given. The challenge lies in preserving that initial mode we enjoyed at the beginning, preserving that self-sufficiency which doesn't answer to philosophical authority, and deploying it in a methodical, rigorous, scientific mode for philosophy, to give philosophy that thing which it so desperately needs, which will free it from itself. And we can't be for philosophy, we can't help liberate it from itself, liberate the human from its determinations, while being yet another philosophy. In the performing of this task, we will see the familiar language of philosophy deployed with new objectives and new rules. Philosophical texts can be challenging enough on their own, without this added emancipatory agenda subverting how that language is used. Some philosophy is accused of being too esoteric in its jargon in a way that unnecessarily isolates many readers. Pop philosophy is sometimes posed as a response to this when it attempts to make philosophical concepts available to a more general audience. But isn't there still a kind of condescending gesture in this? Laruelle takes things in the opposite direction, producing texts that are challenging for both philosophers and non-philosophers alike. There is a democratizing aspect to the difficulty of Laruelle's work, and inversely, an isolation in its comprehension. Laruelle is so busy in amongst the technicalities of the deceptively complex and colossal task he's set for himself that he rarely turns around to see if anyone's still following. If Laruelle did turn around to discover a philosopher behind him following along nicely, he would be disappointed. Non-philosophy ought to be incomprehensible to philosophy. As he traverses the terrain of human thought, which he calls non-thetic transcendence or the non-one, Laruelle tries to move across it in ways that are non-philosophical, in ways that are impossible for the philosopher to follow. This doesn't mean coming up in opposition to philosophy, that's not what the non here is doing, but rather entails non-Euclidean trajectories along a plane inaccessible to philosophy. So if philosophers aren't following, not philosophers personally, but the philosopher inside each of us, that's a good sign, a necessary feature of non-standard thought, even a guiding principle. Because of our habits of thought, it's easy to forget, and so worth emphasizing, that non-philosophy doesn't use philosophy in the same way philosophy uses philosophy or regards itself.
Every word you say to me is stupid.
I wanted to make sure you'd feel comfortable with me.
Non-philosophy gives philosophy a completely different function to what philosophy pre-decides for itself. This is a challenging notion because we have all been trained and are in a habit of thinking philosophically. But appreciating this early on can make you more sympathetic to Laruelle's efforts to, in a sense, lose the philosopher on his tail. It is non-philosophy, so he's still moving through the same familiar rooms. It still looks like philosophy and is still philosophy in one sense, but it is no longer determined by philosophy. Rather, we say it is determined by the one. From the perspective of non-philosophy, philosophy has lost its authority and now functions as support. It supports non-philosophy by offering itself as material and space to move in. Philosophy finds this perspective uninteresting and immediately subsumes it into whatever form the occasion dictates, be it Hegel, Kant, whatever. Philosophy's default posture towards any thought practice seeking to mobilize it is the same. Every philosopher is expert at subordinating such cases into their system of thought. Fair enough. But what if we discovered a thought practice, specifically for philosophy, that was so radically immanent that there just isn't room for philosophy to move and fit round the other side of it? Let's say it's so tightly pressed up against the lived decision that makes philosophical thought possible that philosophy is necessarily oblivious to it. What is the unphilosophizable cause of all philosophy? What determines it in the last instance? That is, after all philosophical explanations are said and done, philosophy is determined by the one in the last instance, not a philosophically ambitious totalizing one, rather this one, which is all there is. There is an immanent, finite, present, lived experience determined in the last instance, inaccessible to philosophy, that philosophy can never be about, but which determines all philosophy and everything else. This is the one. Of course, non-philosophy is determined by the one too. The occasion always is. But unlike philosophy, non-philosophy submits to the one and accepts this determination in order to think philosophy according to the one. Inversely, philosophy hallucinates a thinking of the one without any support and according to its own authority. Philosophy fantasizes a departure from the one in order to generate philosophical concepts. Thus, philosophy is in need of a divestment of the authority of these concepts, an acknowledgement of its determination by the one, the revealing of its transcendental support structures. Let them be discovered and revealed as an immanent chaos, to expand what we can do with philosophy. Non-philosophy is pure practice and non-authoritarian. Its source and supports are declared at the outset, namely the one and philosophy respectively. This is an unnecessary and overcomplicated procedure from the perspective of philosophy, and philosophy will eagerly stack the blame for these aspects of non-philosophy on Laruelle. But the non-philosopher, uninvested in philosophy as an institution of thought, will naturally throw the blame back at philosophy itself. The complexity of non-philosophy doesn't come from its axioms, which are necessarily simple, but from the complexity of its object and side of practice, namely philosophy. We can forgive densely complex prose when the thing it's describing is also densely complicated. We are used to thinking of specific philosophers as complicated. Being in time is complicated because being is a complicated question, and Heidegger goes to great lengths to demonstrate this complexity at the outset. However, the decision to think philosophically is its own lived problem and cannot be posed by philosophy, which has already made the decision. Of course, philosophers love to ask the question, what is philosophy?
The question, what is philosophy, can perhaps be posed only late in life, with the arrival of old age and the time for speaking concretely. It is a question posed in a moment of quiet restlessness, at midnight, when there is no longer anything to ask. It was asked before. It was always being asked, but too indirectly or obliquely. The question was too artificial, too abstract. Instead of being seized by it, those who asked the question set out and controlled it in passing. There was too much desire to do philosophy to wonder what it was, except as a stylistic exercise.
Yet despite this early lucid comment, Deleuze and Guattari were unable to exercise the circular topology inherent in the gesture of philosophy, the deployment of a thought sufficient for the answer to that question, what is philosophy, while simultaneously being the object in question. Does the question itself not evince some hallucinatory state when the thing in question is the asking of the question? It is philosophy that concerns itself with questions like, what is philosophy? Philosophy labours over its presuppositions while ignoring the decision it's made in performing that work. Non-philosophy takes the existence of philosophy as given, but is also indifferent to this existence. It doesn't need it to be there to justify itself. Philosophical material, and thus non-philosophy itself, was merely discovered.
We do not have to philosophize it as having already taken place, but instead we have to know it, to produce knowledges oriented around it.
Philosophy is an object that has emerged presently as a potential site where we can apply this science. But we are in the habit of assuming this topic of inquiry needs to be defined, including its reasons and its uses. As far as non-philosophy is concerned, philosophy is its own shown identity. It needs no further explanation. But asserting this against the standard inclinations is an uphill battle. The pattern philosophers find so exhilarating, which Deleuze exposed in The Image of Thought, that is the revelation of presuppositions, needs to be globally shifted in a new vision. This can feel like we're adding an extra step, a further abstraction or a philosophical doubling over, making the complexity of Laruelle's project seem especially unreasonable and intolerable. But this is because we're already doubled over, on the floor, burdened with this need to constantly fold each thought back in on itself with the celebrated reflexive posture. Despite how it presents itself, there is nothing liberating about these appeals to a self-awareness. Philosophy, and thought more generally, is used to being able to claim sufficiency for anything and everything it encounters. Nothing is too strange or too large for at least a thought to encompass. The force of thought resists all finitudes pertaining to its movements. It refuses all parameters imposed on it by subsuming them into itself. Philosophers are therefore understandably appalled at the non-standard inversion, which refuses to be absorbed into any philosophy, and they are left with nothing to do with it. The mere existence of non-philosophy constitutes an automatic critique, a real critique, of philosophy's circular motions. The authority it gives itself to determine all beings, including itself, being the Parmenidean one. Laruelle's genius lies in what he discovered could be left on the table. When thought is unidirectional and uninterested in itself, when it thinks once each time, it can take on truly new and previously unthinkable forms. What is the shape of philosophy? The shape of this style of thought that cannot be discerned along its sanctioned paths. For non-philosophy to be the science it claims to be, having philosophies available to it as material, it makes a rule for itself that it cannot assume this shape. Non-philosophy is never a circle and never folds back on itself. This rule is not based on any philosophical arguments, but rather must be accepted at the outset. No philosophical justification for it will be provided, though it always has already been proved according to the one. Ultimately, this is not an intellectual maneuver, but a posture or vision of thought that is also a vision in accordance with radical immanence or the one. Laruelle calls this vision in one. It's like watching a screen and the content on the screen at the same time so as to divest the content of its claims to an ultimate reality. Then we can see the real shape of the image, that it transpires on a flat surface. or in philosophy's case, the break from the real, its division, to fulfill its goals to circumnavigate itself. However, these structures of thought are so labyrinthine and elaborately built up, achieving and maintaining this vision can be difficult. How accessible you find philosophy and non-philosophy, and/or Laruelle's work, will depend on 3 factors. 1. Your tolerance for reading through parts you don't understand. 2. Your background in philosophy. And 3. How attached you are to philosophical authority. While you'll need a notion of philosophy's broad historical project and trends, a philosophical foundation, an awareness of the material that is going to be non-philosophy's object to follow what he's doing, it's this very philosophical training that will need to be not unlearned, but its authority will need to be given up, in a sense. So there's an irony here in that anyone qualified enough to follow what Laruelle's doing is going to be less likely to forsake their philosophical training for professional, personal, maybe spiritual reasons. They have an investment in this enterprise, and non-philosophy is really going to mess with it. We're not going to kill philosophy, but we are going to upset some sacred sites. Doing so will require that we know their location, how to get there, etc. This means we can't stop being philosophers. The labour of non-philosophy requires a vision of our dual status as both non-philosophers and philosophers, this time in that exact order. What then would be the appeal of non-philosophy to the philosopher, the kind of person who is best equipped to understand it? It takes a specific kind of person to stumble upon and commit themselves to the labour of studying Laruelle. This is because it's very difficult to communicate what non-philosophy actually does and what it's for. Here it is. Non-philosophy is for philosophy without being philosophy. It's for humans without being a humanism. Everyone starts reading Laruelle for the fulfillment of some application or new philosophy. This is to say, they come to non-philosophy from philosophy, with philosophical expectations and demands. But non-philosophy will not give them what they seek. Laruelle's work can be incredibly powerful at undermining the authority of deconstruction. This is how I came to non-philosophy and how I was able to resolve many difficulties I had while writing my PhD thesis about video games and anthropology, which, as I write this, is currently undergoing examination. Rather than deconstructing video games with a differentiating procedure that generates binaries, a common practice in anthropological literature, I was inspired by a different aspect of the medium. It was the potential for ethnography to allow the phenomena in question to determine how we go about understanding it. In the case of my dissertation, this meant assuming a posture open enough to permit video games to influence and even critique the anthropological method. To do this, I tried to put anthropology on the same level as video games, to frame anthropology as an image-generating technology. Anthropology generates images, representations, even concepts of the human as byproducts of its practice. Video games are a ready-made, automatic, real critique of the reductions of the human inherent in the performance of anthropology. This critique comes out of the non-philosophical vision in one, more easily achieved in video games than in anthropology or philosophy. But my purpose here is not to summarize my PhD, and I only bring it up for 2 reasons. 1, to show you a practical example of how Laruelle's thought might be used, and 2, because I think video games can make it easier to understand non-philosophy. Like video games, and of course like anthropology, philosophy is an image-generating technology. Philosophy produces descriptions, images of being in the form of ontologies, or knowing in the form of epistemologies. Video games do this too, not only in the industry's aspirations towards realism, but in the phenomenology of how we experience them. They generate immanent experiences that are extensions from a point of view. Both video games and philosophies generate worlds. Kant's transcendental idealism or Deleuze's transcendental materialism, for example, are worlds with their own rules and textures in the same way Dwarf Fortress or Cyberpunk 2077 are. The difference is that the insurmountable chasm dividing video game worlds from the real, that unidirectional difference separating them from the lived conditions that bring them about, the intuition that video games constitute another sphere of action that is not equivalent to immanent lived experience. More precisely, it is not equivalent according to how we experience and value video games. Well, philosophy feigns such an equivalence and actively resists being sublimated into cultural material. This is why Laruelle will sometimes say philosophy is hallucinatory. It hallucinates a reversibility back into the one, which is like a video game claiming to simulate or perform a true reduction of the entire universe, including all other simulations or video games, including the conditions of its own development. It seems ridiculous when we're talking about video games, but this is really what, according to Laruelle, philosophy does. This point often serves as its initial thesis, out of which the rest of non-philosophy matures.
One philosopher does not succeed another without claiming to succeed philosophy itself as a whole.
The difference between video games and philosophy, in the way we are regarding them here, is that philosophy is a much older, more developed, sophisticated, and complex technology. The whole enterprise of philosophy has become so elaborate in its efforts to resist being suspended as material, to resist being accountable and determined by ordinary finite individuals, that it has become worse than useless. It is an overbearing authority that we constantly submit the determination of our lives and thoughts to. These ancient structures always seeking to determine us and never to be determined by us. And the thought of putting philosophies to work, making them subject to our creative needs and whims, rarely happens. But Laruelle's non-philosophy is that thought, more emancipatory than the anti-fascism of something like Anti-Oedipus, not for its superior deconstruction, but for its simple, somewhat naive materialism. In the same way we play, mod, emulate, and break video games, and we do so necessarily as part of our enjoyment of them as mere material, video games have no authority over our lives, but our worlds, constituting experiences determined by us. Laruelle is saying, let it be so for philosophy. Let's play philosophy like we play video games.